Greetings. Today I'm going to explain the interpersonal theory of suicide, what it tries to do, the pieces it's built from, the testable claims it makes, and what the current research so far tells us about whether those claims hold up. It is thus far the most influential theory framework on suicide and will be the guiding framework for today's video. So, why is this theory important? Why does it matter? Many people think about suicide, and far fewer go on to make a lethal or near lethal attempt. The interpersonal theory is important because it separates those two problems. In plain terms, it asks why do some people develop the desire to die, and why do only some of those people move from desire to action? Treating ideation and attempts as partly different processes helps both researchers and clinical assessments focus on the right mechanisms. The three core components. The theory centers on three proximal constructs: thwarted belongingness, a deep sense of social disconnection, feeling alone, not part of a group, or that you don't belong; perceived burdensomeness, the belief that you are a burden to others and that those people would be better off if you were gone; capability for suicide, a reduced fear of death and greater tolerance for physical pain that makes serious self-harm possible. Put simply, thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness is hypothesized to generate suicidal desire or suicidal ideation. Capability for suicide explains who is able to convert that desire into action. The interpersonal theory isn't vague, it makes falsifiable claims. Thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness each predict suicidal thoughts. Together, they predict stronger ideation. If thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness are experienced as hopelessly unchangeable, passive thoughts become active suicidal desire. Active desire plus an elevated capability for suicide predicts attempts. So the theory points to a specific interaction. Thwarted belongingness multiplied by perceived burdensomeness leads to ideation, and the thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness multiplied by capability leads to attempts. What the empirical evidence thus far shows, a short summary rather, is that a large synthesis of the literature have tested these ideas across many samples. The broad pattern is supported, but with important qualifications. Perceived burdensomeness tends to show the strongest direct association with suicidal thoughts. Thwarted belongingness also relates to ideation, but usually less strongly than burdensomeness. Capability for suicide, while central for predicting action, typically shows only small correlation with attempts across large samples. Tests of the multiplicative hypotheses. The interaction between thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness on ideation and the three-way interaction, including capability on attempts, are statistically significant in some analyses, but the effect sizes are modest. In other words, the perfect storm interaction effects exist, but are small and inconsistent. Important caveats and measurement gaps. There are several reasons to be cautious about overinterpreting these results. Many studies are cross-sectional, so they cannot establish that thwarted belongingness or perceived burdensomeness causes later attempts. Longitudinal tests of the ideation leads to action sequence are still relatively few. A key part of the theory, the idea that hopelessness about the tractability of thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness pushes people from passive to active desire, is rarely measured directly. That's a major measurement gap. Studies use different versions of the same questionnaires and sample very different populations. Student communities, clinical, military, creating heterogeneity that makes pooled results noisy. Some outcomes are measured dichotomously, ever attempted versus never, which reduces statistical power and obscures nuances compared to continuous measures of attempt, severity, or frequency. So what does this mean for clinicians and prevention. Assessing belongingness and perceived burdensomeness is clinically useful. Both are meaningfully related to suicidal thoughts and are appropriate targets for conversation and intervention. However, thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness should not be treated as sole predictors of who will attempt suicide. Capability and other risk factors matter too, and prediction is probabilistic, not deterministic. Interventions that reduce isolation, increase meaningful social connections, or directly address beliefs about being a burden are conceptually aligned with what the theory highlights. Clinicians and researchers should treat hopelessness about interpersonal change as an important therapeutic target and measurement priority. Now, what does this mean specifically for researchers? The priorities are that there are more longitudinal studies that can test whether thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness precede and predict escalation from ideation to attempt, development and validation of direct measures of hopelessness about interpersonal problems, and consistent use of instrument versions to improve comparability. So there is also a need for a broader, diverse samples and finer grained measures of attempt severity, as that will help clarify when and for whom the theory best applies. The interpersonal theory provides a clear and useful framework that distinguishes desire from action and highlights social mechanisms in suicide risk. Evidence generally supports the theory's broad predictions. Burdensomeness and belongingness are linked to ideation, capability relates to action, but the multiplicative interaction effects are small and modest and variable. Better measurements, especially of hopelessness about the word of belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, longitudinal designs, and standardized instruments are needed to test the theory's clinical predictive utility. So, as a closing, that's the interpersonal theory of suicide in a nutshell. What it explains, what it claims, and what the data so far say. If this video raises personal concerns for you or someone you know, please reach out to local emergency services or a crisis line. Right now, help is available, and please, please utilize them. So, this theory overall helps explain why people think of suicide and why people die by suicide. And I hope you walked away learning something new. Thank you.